I mean, you know, Santa Fe is an interesting place, I think, for any Indian artist because it's both, I think it's a love-hate relationship for me, you know, to think about the market pressure for artists here, and especially during a time of something like Indian market. And, you know, I don't know, there's all of these different subcategories of the Southwest market, and it's one of the places in the United States which was designated to become a market for Native American people.
I just want to start by talking about the title, because what I see is such complex work. I mean, just the materials, the optical play. I see the familiarity of your own geometric work from your past, but I see brand new things that I couldn't even have thought up even when you described it to me. So can you relate the title and how you came to title this group? Because individually they have very distinct titles too. So trade is a very simple word with a lot of history to it. And I wonder how you came to the title.
You know, it goes back to probably when I was 22, I worked at the Field Museum, and this was 1992. And I actually started working there because it was the best paid position I could find. So I had no idea, and that was at the time of NAGPRA, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with NAGPRA, but it was this, it still is, it wasn't in the past entirely, but it was a law, Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And my job was to assist with tribal delegations to come in and research collections affiliated with their tribe. So a lot of it was always based on the aesthetic quality and the designs and the family designs and traditions. And what was interesting to me was there was this group that I stumbled across, which were the unidentified objects, because they couldn't establish the tribal affiliation based on design. And those objects were not regulated by NAGPRA because no one really knew how to read them. And what I was interested in was that they really represented the maker's choices, and they kind of escaped museum curators and anthropologists and ethnographers being able to come in and say, oh, this belongs to a collective rather than an individual. And anyways, when you look at those objects, I mean, it's kind of astounding, like the different linings people would put into things, the different additions as things were handed down from generation to generation. And those objects were changing as history went on. So as trade was happening, maybe a spoon would become an ornament, or maybe a mirror would suddenly begin to show up, or different fabrics would show up, different dyes, blankets, those sorts of things were happening. And you realize that these objects really, without any of our descriptions, already escaped any simple definition, without us, you know, ever coming in to look at them or describe them. So that was really intriguing to me. One, because they're already global objects, you know, before this term globalism became kind of a hot word to talk about culture and art making. And I'm sure it extends to beyond Native American objects, but you're seeing everything from Europe to Asia in these objects, in the materials, in the dyes, and it also is before we're able to even begin to talk about colonialism. So just the term trade is so loaded before all of these other theories that, of course, I learned in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so this work is kind of just, you know, I've done previous work before that did address things like the post-colonial aspect of materials, but this is really trying to be in the mind of someone who's really quite playful with visual history. It's like growing up within modern and mainstream contemporary culture, that idea of appropriation and quotation is how it functions. But it's different when we talk about tradition. So there's this shift where you step over, you know, back and forth. And but then I realized I can look at someone's pot, or I can look at a basket weaving, or I can look at a textile weaving, but it's not my story. And it's almost like I don't really know what I'm talking about. So I can only go back to a really elemental way of going, like, it's a line, it's a color, it's about speed. But so you make all this work trying to appease people. And I mean, I really do believe in art because I think a lot of that work still fails on so many levels. But once you start aligning yourself with Indian makers, like, it's not about that anymore. For me, I felt a real shift. It's, you know, I'm quoting from people who came before me. I mean, I didn't make this stuff up. You know, I just put it together. So. So.
Well, and you've also mentioned to me that in looking at this body of work that it was harder for you to quote from Native sources than it was to quote from Western art history. Mm-hmm. And can you talk about what that difficulty is, how you approach that?
I think it's about knowing the story to tell, and the story to tell that's worth telling. And how do you push it past? Because I can't just quote another person's story or another person's culture.
You were saying that this is the first time you've really felt comfortable in your work, and I think it comes across that it's familiar and yet it's brand new to you at the same time.
Part of that just has to do with taking it off the stretchers, because when it's on the stretcher, you already start with some element of the finished product. Whereas these, they can have additions continually until the very end. Whether it's a bead placed somewhere or it's another piece of painted something. Or what's interesting with these is also even the negative shapes that are cutting into things. Those are really exciting for me. And I don't know. And I really wanted to accentuate the object of them, and that's something that I've struggled with because I've been educated to think that when a painting becomes an object, that's bad. But then suddenly taking it off of the stretchers, the object it addresses an entirely different history, I guess, rather than a painting history.
And there's a liveliness in this.
Yeah.
And I hadn't thought of it, but it's a really great description that these can continue to grow. I mean, there's this potential that these can multiply. If you close the door, turn out the lights, maybe there'll be more when you come back in the morning.
Right. Well, and also even, like for the shows coming up, like we're playing around with how light works on them and how they drape and how they slump on the floor and how a wall-based textile becomes a rug and extends out onto the floor and what that does to a viewer, or their flags, So there's so many ways to address this that weren't there with the painting.
Right.
So we had all these paintings in the studio and that were either never finished or some of them I never showed. And I hope no one owns a laundromat, but I take them to the laundromat and I wash them. And I don't think we ruin laundry washing machines, I'm not 100% sure. But we wash them until they become more of a textile. The paint starts to fall off and the fabric is shrinking and it's making the oil paint pucker, and it just destabilizes the whole painting and it really kind of renews the piece. So where you're seeing, some of the, what's back here is a washed earlier painting, and these paintings, some of them go back to 2002, and then to cut them up, is an interesting thing because you're really just disempowering that whole way of working. You're just you're telling the artwork that you're not going to do that anymore, So the quote for that, I guess, is more just, and everyone was saying, they're like, everyone's concern is are you sure? Are you sure you're going to wash them? They're going to be gone. You're not going to have them anymore. But, ultimately it doesn't really matter. I mean, they've, for the purposes that I made them for, it was really to get to here. That's already been achieved, so I can let it go. It's actually healthier for me to let it go. My grandmothers made quilts. They made clothes. One of my grandmother still reworks, takes apart sweaters and makes pot holders, So it's just that thing about just making things continually. And, this is the materials that were available.
So you had this rich archive of paintings, and then you washed them and left all the parts in the washing machine, which I think would make a great video to find the next load of clothing, right, to find out what happened to that. But also talk about, so you're putting them together, but you're also embellishing them with this work in the beadwork that's quite stunning, and the metal that punctuates these. So talk about that. How did you come to that decision?
It's really borrowing from the language of vendors at powwows is something that I'm always get caught up in looking at things and figuring out how I can work a pink, wolf skin in something, which hasn't happened yet. But I mean, it's kind of this bizarre collection of things that have happened over the past 100 years, a couple hundred years. And the beads are, beads are interesting because they just have that charge of being a quote-unquote traditional material, when in fact I think everyone knows that they're not necessarily a traditional material. They've become a traditional material, but they really are modern. I mean, from their inception, they're modern. So,
and global trade.
Yeah.
They came into this continent as trade goods, absolutely.
Yeah, and that these here, you know, are actually from India. Well, not all of them are from India. Some of them are still from Poland.
Each painting holds that quality of the archive for me, that I can't quite place everything, but yet I know I've seen it before. And that power, I think, really comes together. And from my sense, that's where my notion of trade comes into that, because the historical idea of a textile versus the beadwork versus the metalwork all have these moments when they come into the history of this work. So for me, then you put them together in this moment in time. They're just wonderful objects. So this brings up the issue of continuation. So as an idea of sort of here is where you are today. This is the work that you bring here to Santa Fe. Where are you going to go from here? What's on your mind as you work on this? Because I know you have a list of things you're
Well, I mean, in the shortest way possible, really briefly, there was an exhibition in 1941 at MoMA, and that was the exhibition that I became interested in. And it was really relatively progressive for the time, and it was cut short due to the war, and due to World War II, and the fear of socialism and communism, and collective communities were kind of tagged as having qualities of socialism and communism. But, you know, Native American arts were a huge part of modernism, and not just as references for, you know, Jackson Pollock and, you know, the heroes of modernism, but really contributing to design and language. And so the exhibition in the spring is really about, you know, where would we be as I'm not that young anymore, but where would we be as younger artists had that dialogue continued since 1940? You know, we'd be looking at a 70-year dialogue that, had it developed much like, you know, young African-American artist dialogues or just the dialogue of modernism, we would be someplace really different, I think, in terms of, you know, we'd be a broader pop cultural influence.
That was an extraordinary exhibition. We've talked about it. There were actually Navajo artists and Navajo singers and medicine men who were in the gallery creating sand paintings. Jackson Pollock has actually referenced some of that work as being very influential for him. So it was a great meeting of modernism and indigenous art forms here. So now you're here with this body of work and these ideas for your future. So where do you think this work will go? Will you continue in this line of work, just as a way of summing up?
This opportunity to show in Santa Fe was really to experiment with some ideas for the upcoming exhibitions. And then I didn't think they would end up being such significant pieces in their own right, but they were. I mean, I'm really pleased with the show. I think it looks great. I'm really happy with it, and yeah, so it's and that's also just a shift in the way that, you know, I think as any artist, at some point you stop focusing on just the next thing and you start thinking about your life. And so this is really the beginning, I think, of a very, very, I don't know how I'm gonna, this is a long trajectory. This is the beginning of that. So but that's a good thing.
Well, I think everybody joins me in wishing you a long and very creative life, because we certainly want to see where this will go. So thank you.
Thank you.
For a lot of artists, color really reflects things going on in their lives. And I'm wondering, how does that work in yours, since I see this vibrant color coming out?
Yeah, I mean, I think these colors, I mean, I've always used a lot of color, and I think when you use a lot of color, sometimes people think that means you don't know how to use color, and I've certainly received that criticism before. But I would always refer people to powwows. I'd be like, you know, if you look at how people put together powwow outfits, I mean, my God, I'm conservative with color. So it's like, but that was always my reference in the beginning, because I was, you know, it was fluorescence and oranges and patterns and gifts and traditional, you know, generational gifts down the line. So all of that, when it comes together, it almost becomes like a sign of fear when I see anyone repressing being able to enjoy something like color, or being able to enjoy something like this mashup mix that happens because it's bigger than you. It's not just you designating all the decisions. And now that's such a laborious chore to me. I'm just like, I would never want to be the only person in charge of my life anymore. It's just not anything that I'm interested in. So I'm sure it is a reflection. All right, thank you so much for coming.
See, you could have done this by yourself. You just needed a prompt.
Are you kidding me? You're great.
Oh, you're so...